She broke no laws, but a black woman in an evening gown got pulled over just for looking suspicious. One cop shoved a flashlight in her face and smirked. "Whose trophy wife are you?" They thought she was powerless, but had no clue her husband is a senior agent at the Department of Justice. "What state do you live in? Do cops get away with this where you are? Watch till the end to see what happens when they mess with the wrong woman." The gala's music was still fading from the folds of Olivia Wallace's deep blue gown as she stepped into the night. The heels of her stilettos touched the curb with the same silence that marked her every calculated move. She slid into the driver's seat, smoothed the edge of her skirt, started the engine, and guided her sleek black sedan out into the sleeping city. Midnight had settled on the quiet streets like glass, clear, still, reflective. Olivia's grip on the wheel was gentle but firm, her nails lacquered, clean, the gesture deliberate. She drove through neighborhoods where porch lights blinked behind half-drawn curtains, where wind curled in alleyways, and the world had momentarily forgotten its noise. Then the lights hit, blue, rotating, artificial, slicing through the rearview mirror like a scalpel through skin. Olivia didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. The sirens didn't blare, not yet, but the signal was unmistakable. 2 white patrol officers and a cruiser had decided she didn't belong on this road. She slowed, signaling as if rules still mattered, and pulled to the curb. The patrol car followed. Then, nothing. No immediate steps, no greeting, just high-beam headlights pointed directly at her mirrors, burning white into the cabin, fracturing the calm. The light wasn't just bright, it was a statement. It said, "We don't knock. We blind." Olivia kept both hands on the wheel, 10 and 2. Her posture textbook perfect, her shoulders upright but never stiff. She didn't reach for her bag. She didn't lower her window. She waited. Not out of fear, out of protocol, out of the silent, practiced choreography every black professional knows by instinct but never teaches aloud. The doors of the cruiser opened. 2 figures emerged, outlined in the glare. One took his time adjusting his belt, walking slowly, predatory. The other came in closer. The first step into the cone of the headlights revealed his face. Lean, shaved, pale under the brim of his hat, he held a flashlight low and swung it like a lazy blade. He rapped twice on the glass, knuckles dull against the silence. Olivia lowered the window halfway. The officer leaned in, and for a moment their faces were close enough to exchange breath. Then he raised the flashlight, slowly, deliberately, and shone it straight into her eyes. "Is this your vehicle?" he asked. The beam didn't waver. She didn't answer. Her hands didn't leave the wheel. She blinked once, slowly. Her expression didn't shift. The officer's lips twitched into something between amusement and suspicion. He clicked his tongue and stepped back, motioning to his partner. The second officer approached the passenger side, mimicking the same angle, same distance, same tone. "No reason to be nervous, ma'am," he said, though his voice lacked any intent of comfort. It was procedural, almost boring. Still, Olivia said nothing. "Mind opening the trunk?" the first one asked. No probable cause, no citation, no preamble. She stared straight ahead, the soft reflection of his flashlight bouncing in her pupils. He added, "Just routine." Olivia reached slowly to the center console, popped the trunk, then returned both hands to the wheel. Neither officer moved to check it. Instead, the second one whispered, not to her, but sideways, into the thick night. "This time," he muttered, "make sure you get the footage right." There it was, the confirmation. This wasn't enforcement. This was a rehearsal. They weren't fishing for evidence. They were feeding a habit, running a script. The first officer leaned in again, flashlight still up, close enough that Olivia could feel the heat of the bulb on her cheek. He looked her over slowly, as if studying her silence for signs of threat or defiance. But there was nothing. Not a breath wasted, not a flicker of voice, only stillness, only hands, brown against the black leather of the steering wheel, motionless. A face lit too brightly by a stranger's suspicion, but unyielding in its composure. The silence between them became heavy, not tense with the threat of gunfire, but worse. A choking, asymmetric weight that came from a knowing both parties refused to name. Olivia had been here before, so had they. But this time, she didn't flinch. She didn't beg. She didn't explain. Because there was nothing to explain. She had broken no law. They had offered no reason. And yet here she was, trapped not by force, but by the performance of authority. The second officer walked to the rear of the car, his steps slow, dragging, not inspecting anything, just moving, just taking up time. The other lingered, still leaning slightly, holding the flash like it had a job. Olivia's fingers flexed slightly around the wheel, barely perceptible. It was the only sign of life, a pulse measured in grip strength. The officer noticed. He smirked. "No need to get tense," he said. "We're just making sure everything's in order." Still, she gave him nothing. No raised voice, no tears, no panic, only the unbearable clarity of a woman who knew the rules better than the men trying to bend them. The flashlight lowered, finally. The officer stepped back, breathing a short sigh like he'd been denied some unspoken pleasure. His partner returned from behind the vehicle, shrugged. "Looks clean," he said, eyes not on the car, but on Olivia. "Always on, Olivia." The first officer tapped the side of her window. "You have a good night," he said, with the same tone you'd use to end a game, not an encounter. They walked away without apology, without explanation, their patrol car easing back into traffic like none of it mattered. The lights died, the road remained quiet. But something had shifted. Not in Olivia's expression, that hadn't changed, but in the silence that lingered behind them. The kind of silence that waits, the kind that remembers, the kind that writes things down. She didn't move immediately. Her hands still rested on the wheel, the engine humming, the street empty. Her breath came slow and steady, but her eyes, sharp, dark, wide open, stared into the mirror not for safety, but for record. They had looked at her and seen a symbol. She had looked back and seen a system. No words were needed, but the injustice had spoken for itself, loud, blinding, and stupid in its confidence. The engine still whispered beneath her fingers, but Olivia hadn't moved. The patrol car had pulled away, but the residue of its presence lingered in the streetlight haze. Her skin still carried the echo of flashlight heat. She shifted her eyes slightly, enough to register the interior of the car, still intact, untouched, unbroken, except for the pause that now lived between breath and motion. Then came the sound again. Tires, slow, returning. One of them had circled back. Not both, just one. A knuckle rapped against the glass. Less official this time. More like a tap you'd give a vending machine to see if it still worked. Olivia lowered the window 2 inches. The face was the same. Square jaw, cheap aftershave, a tan line where sunglasses had been, even though it was midnight. His flashlight was off now, but his stare carried its voltage. "What do you do, ma'am?" he asked. The ma'am didn't carry respect. It carried suspicion, smeared with sarcasm. She replied, calm and clean, "Financial consultant." He laughed. It wasn't loud. It was worse. It was personal. He drew back half a step and repeated the words like they were a punchline he'd heard in the locker room. "Financial consultant? Out here? Dressed like that? Tonight's a real unicorn event, huh?" His smirk widened, aimed not just at her but at the idea of her. Professional, elegant, composed, breathing the same air as his rules. His partner reappeared, silent at first, then shifting his belt in a way that suggested routine, boredom, possession. He gestured loosely at her handbag on the passenger seat. "We should check that," he said. "No pleas, no request, just expectation." "There's no warrant," Olivia answered, her voice razor flat, yet not raised, only measured. "No need," the first one interrupted, reaching as if rights were suggestions. She beat him to it, flipping open the clasp with 2 fingers. Her wallet sat neatly on top. She opened it, revealing ID, credit cards, and a corporate badge. Before he could read, his hand knocked it aside, fingers brushing the edge of the leather. "We don't need to see that," he muttered almost dismissively, as if her effort had offended him. The message was clear. It wasn't about verification, it was about subordination. The second officer clicked his tongue and let his flashlight glide over her legs, pausing deliberately at her shoes, navy stilettos, polished, pointed, expensive. Then the light crawled upward, hesitating just a moment too long across the neckline of her gown. His grin was slower this time, dirtier in the quiet. "Don't tell me this is somebody's wife," he said, voice coated with crude delight. "Boss's wife, maybe?" The question wasn't meant to be answered. It wasn't even really a question. It was a performance, shared theater between men who never expected to be corrected. His gaze lingered, daring, then drifted to his partner with the unspoken joke passed between them like gum under a table. Power in casual mockery, justice in bad taste. Olivia didn't respond, not with words. Her hand returned to the wheel, her fingers curled slightly tighter, not trembling, just firmer, like a cord being pulled taut. Her eyes, when they lifted, didn't flicker. They burned, not with fury, but with the kind of heat that melts steel silently, without ceremony. The first officer leaned down again, close enough that she could count the broken capillaries in his cheek. "You know," he said, "we stop people for a lot less." The implication hung there like spoiled meat in warm air. She blinked once. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was tactical, and it belonged to her. He stepped back, maybe a fraction uneasy now. Something in her stillness didn't match the file in his head. She wasn't fidgeting, she wasn't pleading, she wasn't afraid. And fear was part of the script. They knew how to handle fear. What they couldn't handle was precision, composure. A woman whose silence pressed like a gun against the temple of their assumptions. The second officer cleared his throat, looking toward the street like someone might be watching. No one was. The neighborhood was still asleep. But it didn't matter. Something about the quiet felt less safe than before. "You can go," the first one said finally. But Olivia didn't shift gears. Not right away. She waited a second longer, just long enough for them to feel it, that they had been seen, that they hadn't passed unnoticed, untouched, or unchallenged. Her hand moved to the gear shift. The car purred into drive. As she pulled away, she didn't speed up. She didn't look back. Her rear view showed no pursuit, just the shrinking figures of two uniforms standing under a streetlight, suddenly looking like they didn't know what part they'd just played in a story they hadn't written. They hadn't won. They hadn't even finished. They had just been cataloged, without knowing, filed, labeled. And when the time came, they'd remember that look, the one she gave them, not loud, not violent, but carved so deeply into their egos that it would itch under their skin long after their names stopped being relevant. She didn't rush. As the tail lights of the cruiser disappeared into the next block, Olivia reached across her console with the precision of someone choosing a scalpel, not a phone. Her left hand never left the wheel. The screen lit her cheek in a cold blue glow as her thumb tapped once, twice. No scroll, no hesitation. She brought the phone to her ear, her voice barely above a breath, but laced with flint. "I'm being stopped. Same spot. Lights again. No names, no panic. No, please." She set the phone down, screen facing up, call still active. The line stayed open. That was the point. She didn't look at the officers. She didn't need to. She knew they were watching, the way a wolf watches another creature pick up a stone. Suspicion re-entered the air like static. One of them stepped forward. Not with authority, but with offense. His tone was faster now, clipped, and pressed through teeth he no longer bothered to hide. "Calling a lawyer? Or maybe Daddy?" Olivia turned her head slowly, deliberately. Her eyes found his and held, not with challenge but with certainty. She didn't speak. He scoffed. "Or what, calling the guy who paid for that ride?" His gaze raked across the console, trying to spot a brand logo he could recognize. "This thing comes with the job or the dress?" Still nothing. Then she spoke, calm, sharp. The syllables cut through the street's silence like piano wire. "I called the one who's going to end your shift early." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a prediction. It was an arrival, already happening, irreversible, spoken like a weather alert. The second officer stopped halfway between a step and a sneer. His brows twitched in that split second of calculation. the moment where the game shifted and the score became unclear. He looked at his partner, who shrugged, but the set of his shoulders wasn't as smug anymore. "Ma'am," the first one said, trying to recover the rhythm, "we're still within our rights here. Don't make it something bigger." Olivia didn't answer. She didn't blink. The call was still live. That was enough. Every breath she took, every silence she gave, was being fed into another line. Documentation wasn't something she had to announce. It was something she owned, embodied, and made inevitable by posture alone. The second one tried, moving closer. "This doesn't have to go bad. You cooperate, we're out of your hair in 2 minutes." She tilted her head slightly, the kind of shift a lion makes when deciding if it's worth standing. Her hand rested back on the gear shift. Still no words. "Okay, so what?" The first one stepped forward again, more defensive now than dominant. "You think this scares us? A phone call?" That made her smile. Just barely. Not humor, confirmation. She leaned just slightly and whispered, not to them, but into the cabin air that still carried her call. "They're trying." The sentence wasn't for their benefit. It was for the ears on the other end, the ones that mattered. The officers heard it anyway, and something in the way she said it, so quiet, so composed, made them blink harder than a shout would have. Her eyes returned to the man who'd asked about her father. Her gaze didn't rage, it dissected. "You never wonder," she said softly, "why no one teaches you what to do when you stop someone smarter than you?" It landed like ice cracking a windshield. Slow, devastating, without drama, but impossible to ignore. The second officer bristled. "We're not here to get into debates." "Good," she replied, "because I don't debate with habits." The silence was now against them. It pressed on their lungs. Their authority, once weaponized by noise, began to shrink under the precision of her restraint. They didn't retreat, not physically, but something in their posture wavered. The confidence they wore like a badge now looked like a patch ready to peel. They were still in uniform, but they were no longer in control. And Olivia, hand still firm, voice still calm, hadn't moved more than 2 inches. The call stayed on. So did the silence. So did the reckoning. The weight of Olivia's silence still coiled in the air like a wire pulled tight. But the moment was no longer hers alone. A soundless shift in the atmosphere swept through the block, a change not driven by voices or commands, but by gravity. Something unseen had entered the scene. Not a noise, not a flash, but the feel of pressure building behind the eyes, the subtle way the night exhaled without warning. From the far corner of the intersection, where the lamplight failed to claim full dominion, a black SUV rolled into view. No engine growl, no lights. It moved as if it had always been part of the street, just hidden beneath it. It came to a stop in one smooth motion, perfect, precise, final. Then the driver's door opened, slow, deliberate, without urgency or hesitation. A man stepped out. He didn't slam the door, he didn't look around, he simply existed. One step, then another. His shoes didn't echo. They landed with the weight of permanence, not force. He wore a tailored black suit, the lines sharp enough to cut. His gloved hands hung at his sides like promises not yet cashed. He had no badge displayed, no insignia. But everything about him screamed authority, carved from something older than uniform. The first officer noticed him and stiffened, immediately switching stance, his hand brushing the holster out of habit, not intent. "Sir, you need to stay back. This is an active traffic stop." The man said nothing. He walked forward, steady, calm, the kind of pace that refused to acknowledge tension. He stopped 10 feet from Olivia's car. Then, with one motion, he reached into his jacket and withdrew a small leather case. He opened it. Not flashed, not waved, opened it like a statement. Inside, the badge gleamed like a sealed verdict. There was no announcement, no title, just the truth. The second officer took a half step back, involuntarily. "Who are you?" he asked, voice cracking slightly beneath the strain of trying to keep it firm. Before the man could speak, Olivia opened her car door. She stepped out, fluid, composed, the gown moving like storm clouds wrapped around her legs. She didn't look at the officers. She walked to the man's side and stood shoulder to shoulder with him. "He's my husband," she said, and then the man finally spoke, his voice rich with velvet and iron. "My name is Jericho Wallace." He looked at neither officer directly, yet neither could look away. "I'm not here to negotiate." The silence that followed wasn't the absence of noise, it was the removal of breath, the vacuum you feel just before impact. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't cinematic, it was surgical, the kind of quiet that makes your pulse feel like thunder in your ears. The officers didn't draw their weapons. They didn't retreat, but their stance shifted, slightly, like buildings settling under weight they hadn't accounted for. Jericho's presence didn't demand space. It took without gesture, without threat, without asking, and in that moment the wind seemed to hesitate, the branches didn't sway, even the shadows leaned toward him, as if they knew better. He didn't move again. He didn't need to. His eyes, dark, fixed, unreadable, held everything in suspension. This wasn't a man used to shouting. This was a man who made silence do his bidding. An officer cleared his throat, tried again. "Is there a reason you're interfering with an official check?" Jericho didn't answer immediately. He simply looked at the man, a glance so heavy it made words feel inappropriate. Then, with the barest tilt of his head, he asked, "Is there a reason you think this is official?" It wasn't a question, it was a trapdoor. No one stepped forward. No one stepped back. The street, once charged with procedural arrogance, now felt like a chessboard 4 moves from collapse. Olivia stood tall beside him, her posture unchanging, her silence now less restrained and more allied. They didn't need to whisper. They didn't need to plan. Their symmetry had been built long before this night, and now, here in the middle of a forgotten street, at the wrong hour, under the wrong assumptions, they were a storm wearing human skin. The officers weren't outnumbered. They were outclassed, outweighed by a presence no manual had prepared them for. They had brought routine. Jericho had brought consequences, and with one simple, undeniable step into their spotlight, he had turned their authority into something transparent and thin. Jericho hadn't moved. He didn't have to. The silence that settled after his words was no longer empty. It was loaded, dense. The kind of silence that outlined the boundaries of authority and dared you to trespass. The officers were standing, but the ground beneath them was shifting. That sense you get before ice cracks underfoot, before a verdict drops in court, before a gun goes off in a room not expecting one. They felt it. But like men who spent too long believing in uniforms over accountability, they reached for the script. One of them cleared his throat with the kind of confidence that comes not from truth, but from repetition. "We followed procedure," he said, the sentence delivered like a shield too small to cover what was coming. Jericho's head tilted, just slightly. His eyes didn't blink. His voice remained level, almost detached. "You didn't ask for identification," he began, each syllable precise, the tone stripped of anger but rich with dissection. "You didn't state your reason for the stop. You failed to log the time the interaction began." He listed the failures not like accusations but like items on a grocery receipt. Calm, clinical, inarguable. No one interrupted. "And most importantly," he continued, "you recorded nothing. No body cam notation, no written note, no dashboard timestamp. This wasn't a procedure. This was theater, and your roles were self-appointed." Olivia stepped forward now, slow, composed, with the grace of someone walking through a courtroom she'd memorized in reverse. She didn't speak. She raised her hand and held up a small device, a recorder. The red light blinked in rhythm with the breath of justice waiting to land. She pressed play. The officers' voices began to echo back, casual, cutting, vulgar, and unsanctioned. No edits, no ambiguity. "Is that enough?" she asked, her voice like polished glass. Neither man responded. One of them glanced sideways, the flicker of panic, not yet fully formed but no longer deniable. His partner leaned in, lowered his voice, like that would stop consequences from hearing. "Is he some kind of agent?" Jericho turned his gaze on him. Not quick, not sharp, but heavy. "No," he said. "I'm the man who rewrote this protocol. After people like you twisted it so often, the law no longer recognized its reflection." That landed, not like a punch, like a guillotine. They didn't move, they didn't speak, but their shoulders shifted in that involuntary way guilt travels through bone. Their faces didn't go pale, they went gray, the color that appears when blood doesn't know whether to rush or retreat. No yelling, no accusations, just a legal fact stacked on factual failure. Jericho remained still, the kind of stillness that belongs only to predators and judges. His presence filled the gaps their training never covered. There were no raised voices, no drawn weapons. No chaos, just the unbearable silence that follows truth spoken with the precision of law and the force of someone who knows how to wield it. There was nowhere for them to stand now that the floor had been named. No counter-arguments, no bluff, only a growing awareness that they had not stopped a target, they had triggered a system, and it had come in a suit, with gloves, with evidence in hand, and a name that wasn't loud but would echo nonetheless. They stood frozen, but the freeze wasn't from fear, it was recognition, the kind that hits in delayed waves, when you finally realize the mirror doesn't lie and the man across from you isn't improvising. Jericho hadn't raised his voice, hadn't taken a single step forward, but the space around him had shifted again. He reached into his coat, not fast, not slow, just unshakably deliberate, and pulled out an iPad. No ceremony, no dramatics, just function. The screen lit his face in cold white, and with a few swipes he summoned what they never expected to see in the field, themselves. 3 prior stops, Jericho said, voice steady, tone dry, as if reading a grocery list in a war room. Same time of night. Same language, same absence of body cam footage, no citations, no tickets, no written records, all dismissed as lacking evidence. He turned the screen outward. Each file had a name, a date, a face, no rhetoric, no interpretation, just hard documentation with the weight of something unerasable. The air between them shifted from defensive tension to a quieter dread. The second officer squinted, then blinked twice. The first folded his arms tight, but not to project authority. It was reflex, muscle memory when you realize the cold is inside your uniform, not out. Jericho continued. Each of these interactions was dismissed as isolated, minor, and unprovable, because you designed them to be. He didn't accuse, he explained, which, somehow, cut deeper. Then Olivia spoke, her voice clear, unbothered, cutting in the most elegant way imaginable. "I filed a complaint against them 3 years ago," she said. "The case was labeled, lacking pattern of misconduct. My record was flagged as having a history of provocation." The second officer stiffened. The first one's hand reflexively moved to his belt. Again, not in threat, but in search of something to hold on to. His jaw clicked as he turned, finally making the connection. "You're Olivia Barnes?" he asked, almost choking on the name like it had returned from the dead. She didn't smile. "It's Wallace now." And just like that, the circle closed. This wasn't random. It wasn't a chance. It was a rerun, a loop they thought they'd written until it looped back to bury them. Jericho didn't shift, didn't flinch. "And this is the last time either of you will put your hands near her without consequence." His voice didn't rise. It didn't threaten. It concluded. The first officer opened his mouth, maybe to defend, maybe to deny, but no words came. None would have mattered, because right then, without sound, another figure appeared behind them, a man, dressed in civilian clothes, but with the stillness of someone who didn't need an introduction. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply stood, straight-backed, watchful, and the air changed again. Not colder, not louder, but heavier. The officers turned, subtly at first. They didn't draw back, but they didn't stand firm either. This wasn't backup. This didn't help. This was a witness, a silent anchor dropped into their reality without permission. No words passed. They knew what it meant. Internal affairs didn't need to shout. They only needed to show up. And when they did, the noise stopped carrying weight. Only records remained. Only silence told the truth. Behind Jericho's stillness was something deeper than strategy, older than training. It wasn't just control. It was history, not the kind etched in medals or captured in promotion memos, but the kind that lives in broken radios and closed caskets. As the two officers stood frozen, weighed down by the quiet presence behind them, something flickered behind Jericho's eyes. Not rage, not grief, something smaller, sharper, a sliver of memory, sudden and exact, like a nail punched through drywall with bare hands. It was supposed to be a routine op. Coordinates clean, local intel confirmed, hostile activity is estimated to be minimal. His team was sharp, young, breathing rhythm and precision. He remembered the sunrise from that morning, the way light broke in layers, calm, promising. He remembered trusting the source. Local precinct, friendly unit, confirmed position. Green light. It was a lie. They hit the alley 2 hours later. Wrong turn. No cover. Crossfire. 3 shooters. 1 grenade. 1 scream. Then silence. Isaac didn't make it. His body was found slumped behind the rusted back door of a supply shack. Still clutching his comms unit. Still believing Jericho would come back for him. And he had. Too late. Too clean. No blood on his own hands. That's what made it worse. The report buried it, reclassified, miscommunication, fog of war. Internal protocol marked the error as a misrouted asset. No one was reprimanded. The local officer who'd signed off on the faulty coordinates retired 3 months later with a full pension. Jericho filed a request for review. It never reached the board. Someone pulled the plug. Someone made sure the record stayed bent. He didn't scream. He didn't burn the files. He sat, silent, for weeks. Then Olivia. She hadn't lectured him, hadn't comforted him. She handed him a file, his own, annotated by her, cross-referenced against every routing error in the last 5 years. She didn't say, "I'm sorry." She said, "Read." And he had. Every name, every casualty, every cover-up. That's when he understood. It wasn't one mistake. It was a habit. It was structured. It was dressed in badges and memoranda and signed in triplicate, then filed under unavoidable. He'd looked in the mirror that night, beard grown out, eyes sunken, nothing left of the captain he used to be, and he whispered to himself, not like a vow, not like a prayer, just a truth. I stayed quiet because I thought I wasn't big enough, but silence didn't shrink the system. It shrank me. That sentence never left him. Not when he cut his resignation letter into 12 equal pieces, not when he started learning which loopholes were kept open for convenience, not when he came back, not to clear his name, but to burn the script they kept handing to officers like him, and not tonight, standing beside his wife, facing 2 men who thought they were in charge, who had no idea that their mistake wasn't stopping Olivia Wallace. It was reminding Jericho who he'd once been, before the silence. Jericho didn't look at the officers anymore. They were no longer the center. They were merely symptoms. His attention shifted to the device in his hand. 1 press. The screen lit again, but this time not with evidence for action. He opened a secure app, encrypted end-to-end with no delay, no authorization chain. His voice didn't rise, didn't harden. It became precise. "This is Jericho Wallace. I'm submitting a formal recommendation for the immediate suspension of Officers Daniels and Croft. Attached is recorded evidence of procedural breach, pattern of misconduct, and prior documentation linked to dismissed cases." He paused long enough for the wait to register, then added, "I'm also requesting that cases Barnes 9, Mendez 11, and T. Wallace 14 be reopened immediately." His thumb moved, sending the audio file as naturally as sending a birthday message. Transmission confirmed. The device blinked. Croft's face hardened. "You can't just do this. Not here. Not like this." Jericho turned to him, expression steady, voice low. "I'm not doing anything. The system you ignored is." Daniels stepped forward now, desperation disguised as arrogance leaking from his voice. "We're just following standard habits." Olivia looked at him then, and for the first time that night, she wasn't quiet. She wasn't still. Her voice landed like an indictment written in flame. That's the problem. A habit without law is a crime. Her words sliced deeper than Jericho's data, because they didn't just accuse, they explained. And explanations, when true, make excuses evaporate. Daniels looked away, jaw tight, lips pressed into silence. Croft wasn't finished. You don't get to turn this street into a courtroom. Jericho didn't flinch. He lifted his eyes, clear and clean. We didn't choose this ground. You did. When you made this stop, this place became evidence. They didn't move, couldn't, because now the air wasn't just heavy, it was documented. The space around them had shifted from scene to setting, from chaos to context. This wasn't a mistake in a vacuum, it was the resurfacing of design. Behind Jericho, the investigator still stood, silent, still present, not intervening, just witnessing. But that was enough. His presence meant the data had weight, that the record had already begun. Jericho stepped slightly to the side, clearing Olivia's path as if by instinct, as if they had rehearsed this for years, which, in a way, they had. She moved forward, centered between the officers. No brazen voice, no raised fist, just the weight of her truth, backed by years of being told to wait for timing and process and channels while the system bled people like her slowly and officially. This isn't personal, she said, but it is specific, and that was when they knew. This wasn't about her dress or her voice or even this car. This was about how long they'd been getting away with it. This was about the illusion that every stop vanishes in the dark if no one screams loud enough. But now, every second had been recorded. Every word was in a folder. Every breath they took had a digital witness. Jericho, he didn't celebrate. He didn't lean in for the final blow. He simply let them stand in the space they created. No pushing, no shouting, just one last sentence. We're not ending your careers. You did that. We're just making sure it shows. The silence had reached its edge, stretched taut over the night like wire ready to snap. But Olivia didn't flinch. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone, not with urgency, not with anger, but with the kind of precision that comes when you've waited years for your voice to land where no one can mute it. She unlocked the screen with one flick of her thumb, opened her archive, and turned the display outward. This, she said, voice low and smooth like smoke from a controlled burn, was written 3 years ago. After they pulled me over, after they let me go without explanation, after they smiled like they were doing me a favor for not going further, the screen showed a headline that never ran. Profiled in silence when being seen isn't protection. The byline was hers. The article had been submitted, fact-checked, and even approved, but it never saw daylight. She didn't explain why. She didn't have to, because the next motion was Jericho's. He held up his device, screen tilted just enough to catch the light. No flourish, no drama, just an email, dated, time-stamped, authenticated. The header read, Subject, Barnes, Article, Kill It, Too Political. The signature at the bottom was from the then Chief of Police. Short, cold, undeniable. Keep her name off the board. We don't need heat from the advocacy groups. Spin it internally if needed. Use conflict of interest if it comes up. Daniels stared at the screen like it might disappear if he blinked fast enough. Croft didn't speak at all. The lines in his forehead deepened, his eyes narrowing, not in resistance, but in dread. They understood now. They were not being blindsided by coincidence. They had walked back into the fire they once sparked and thought would burn out on its own. They were not being punished tonight. They were being audited for everything they thought had stayed buried, and there was no exit. Behind them, the stream was still live. Somewhere, on a screen they couldn't see, Olivia's voice was being watched, logged, and reshared. The clip was being recorded in real time by strangers who would not forget. Comments were already pouring in. Screenshots were being saved. No department PR team could stop this. Olivia stepped forward again, a fraction closer to the edge of the curb, just enough to place herself between the streetlight and their shadow. Her eyes glinted, but not with vengeance, with memory, with the weight of too many nights like this one, only without the camera. You don't get to call it protocol, she said, the words slow and deliberate, like bricks being laid. You don't get to call it routine, not when it was designed to be forgotten, not when every time someone like me spoke up, you found a reason to file it under complication instead of evidence. Daniels opened his mouth, then closed it. His jaw moved, but no sound came out. His breath was too loud for the night. Jericho didn't move. His silence wasn't absence, it was force, anchored, absolute. He didn't need to speak. The paper trail had spoken. The past was no longer quiet. It had a URL, a file path, a body count. And then Olivia said it, the sentence she had carried like a live wire coiled under her ribs for too many years. History doesn't repeat itself, she said, unless the people who broke it the first time are forced to stay quiet. That wasn't rhetoric, that was the release. And this time, no one could cut the mic. Olivia's final words still echoed, not in volume but in effect. Her voice wasn't raised. Yet the sentence moved like a detonator wired into the oldest walls of the system, and when truth detonates, it doesn't make a sound. It makes silence implode. Then the movement, measured, undeniable, irreversible. Jericho's phone vibrated once in his hand. He didn't need to check it. He already knew. His thumb slid across the screen. A single message glowed. Emergency suspension. Officers Daniels and Croft, DOJ case code 715F. Attached were 3 embedded signatures, digitally time-stamped. The seal of the Department of Justice. No trial, no delay. This wasn't a suggestion, it was an order. At the same second, across the city, every department terminal received the same directive. Internal networks lit up, servers blinked, an entire precinct paused. 2 names flagged, 2 files reopened, 2 careers sliced open with the same precision they once used to undo others behind code words like routine stop and non-lethal escalation. Daniels reached instinctively for his badge, but the investigator, still silent, still unmoved, stepped forward for the first time. No weapon, no words, just one motion. A hand extended, palm up. Daniels hesitated, but there was nothing left to argue. Slowly, like handing over identity itself, he removed the clipped metal from his chest and placed it into that waiting hand. Croft followed. No ceremony, no resistance. They weren't being arrested. Yet. But something had already been taken from them that could not be returned. Impunity. Jericho's phone vibrated again. A new message. Short. You've just created precedent. It was from the chief. Jericho read it without reaction, without pride. He simply typed back, I'm not here for precedent. I'm here for justice, and hit send. He didn't wait for a reply. Olivia stood at his side, her gaze fixed. Not on the officers now stripped of authority, not on the silent witnesses behind the camera, not even on the growing storm of public reaction that was already spreading across networks and feeds. She was looking through them, through the air, through every instance she'd been stopped, scanned, dismissed, warned, and waved off. And then she said it, not as a headline, not as a quote, but as an incision. I won't be another black woman stopped on the side of the road and filed away like dust. I will be the last one who made it a criminal act to do so. She didn't look angry. She looked done, and that expression, the calm aftermath of someone who's waited too long and finally arrived, was louder than every shout across every protest that had come before. There was no applause, no victory music, just the sound of systems beginning to tremble under their weight. This wasn't a finish line. It was the first crack in concrete that had always pretended to be indestructible, and it had begun with a questionless stop and ended with an answer no one could silence. It should have been a moment of reckoning. Instead, the machinery shifted into defense. The 2 officers who had cornered Olivia that night, faces now etched into national memory, were removed from duty, not with handcuffs, but with paperwork. They walked out under soft lighting, not shame, with clipped statements about pending evaluations, no arrests, no accountability, just delay. Inside a private conference room laced with power and polish, the police chief convened an emergency strategy meeting. The room smelled of leather chairs and disinfectant. The plan was simple: control the damage, not correct the cause. We need to push the narrative toward procedural ambiguity, the chief said, voice sharp, clipped, as if accustomed to stripping truth into pieces small enough to swallow. Call it a misunderstanding, a lapse in protocol, not an abuse. Get the videos down before the evening cycle, one officer muttered. And if we can't kill the video? The chief didn't blink. Then we bury the conversation around it. Focus on intent, not impact. Say the officers felt threatened. Say the light made it unclear. It wasn't strategy, it was choreography. Well practiced, morally bankrupt, flawlessly delivered. Habits, not laws, are running the playbook. But outside that soundproof room, silence didn't stay idle. Jericho had already received the leak. It came from an old acquaintance. Someone who had long since slipped into the gray area between regret and resistance. The message was short. They're meeting now, trying to scrub it all. The timing was perfect, and Jericho didn't waste a second. Within the hour, he published a sealed drive online. Files labeled, time-stamped, irrefutable. Internal emails, raw footage, and procedural logs were never meant for daylight. He didn't leak it to the press. He released it directly to the public, bypassing gatekeepers, bypassing spin. The truth didn't walk through the front door. It detonated in the middle of the hallway. Cameras swiveled, anchors pivoted, hashtags erupted not with outrage but with realization. People weren't surprised, they were reminded. The rot had been visible all along. Now it was simply undeniable. Back in the boardroom, screens lit up in real time. Panic didn't roar, it seethed. One captain stood, jaw tight. We're being walked like dogs by a married couple with a file folder. He meant it as venom, but it landed like a confession, and that's when her voice appeared. Not in person, not through broadcast, but through projection. Clear and commanding. Olivia's pre-recorded statement, part of the newly released files, began to play on every internal device connected to the precinct server. Not loud, but unskippable. This isn't manipulation, she said, voice smooth, stripped of rage, but soaked in consequence. You're not being led by us. You're being dragged by the weight of your own decisions. Her face didn't blink. Her tone didn't spike. She wasn't angry. She was accurate. If the pressure feels unnatural, she continued, it's because you've spent too long in rooms where consequences were optional. This isn't revenge. It's a reflection. Someone reached out to kill the feed. It didn't work. Another tried pulling the network offline. Too late. The message had rooted itself inside the very servers they once used to hide. The chief stood, adjusting his cuffs. Get the legal team. Get ahead of this. But even he knew there was no ahead left. Only aftermath. He stared at Olivia's frozen frame on the screen, teeth set. She wants to break us. From a darkened corner, an older lieutenant finally spoke, voice dry as dust. No, she doesn't have to. We already did that ourselves. Outside the building, protesters didn't shout. They watched. Signs rose without slogans. Just faces, just dates. The department's front steps turned into a silent census. Jericho stood nearby, not center frame, not flanked by cameras, just watching, calculating. His presence didn't provoke. It reminded that justice wasn't chaos. Inside, a younger officer whispered, "Are we being dismantled over one stop?" The answer came not from Jericho, not from Olivia, but from history. From every buried report, every redacted paragraph, every chuckle dismissed a complaint. And as the screens inside flickered with Olivia's closing words, it was no longer about a couple. It was about a culture. "You called it instinct," she said. "We called it a pattern, and patterns, once exposed, demand to be broken." The clip ended, the silence didn't, and in that stillness, the department felt the full weight of a truth they'd spent decades dodging. No sirens, no marches, just exposure. Clean, relentless, final. The floodgates didn't open with fury, but with focus. As the ripple of Jericho's silent defiance circled outward, the public eye turned to Olivia Wallace, no longer the silent figure in the passenger seat, no longer the woman defined by a stop, a stare, and a silence that held more weight than any scream. The network announced the broadcast without fanfare. Live, unedited, Olivia Wallace. The camera found her seated, not styled, not elevated, not softened by lights or filters. She sat like a cornerstone, unshaken, immovable, a figure forged in quiet fire. There were no tears, no theatrics, just facts. Olivia began not with her story, but with names. 3 of them, men and women who had filed complaints against the police department, cases dismissed, buried, or rebranded as misunderstandings. She read their names aloud, then dates, then the locations. She didn't explain the pain. She unpacked the architecture of disregard. With surgical tone, she laid out the procedural amputations. When a call went unanswered, when a badge was shielded by paperwork, when a voice was edited out of a report. She named the officers involved, not with venom, but with a precision that made the air in the studio vibrate. Her words weren't accusations, they were citations. She didn't look into the camera like a victim. She stared through it, like a witness who refused to let the world look away. The anchor sitting across from her shifted, barely breathing. He had expected confrontation, maybe a wound peeled open, but what Olivia gave was worse for those who had written her off. She gave them a mirror, no rage, just recall, no breakdown, just record. When asked how she remembered every detail, she replied without pause, "You don't forget the geometry of fear, you just stop letting it take up space inside you." As she spoke, the screen behind her changed. Without a cue or commentary, it displayed footage, new angles of the night she was stopped. From a camera no one knew existed, one from across the street, another from a rear-view blind spot. Olivia didn't flinch. Jericho stood just off stage, arms folded, face unreadable. He hadn't cued the video. He hadn't needed to. Truth had grown its own hands. One clip showed a flash of the flashlight jerking toward her face. Another captured the subtle movement of the officer's hand brushing her purse away, dismissive, invasive. The silence between those seconds was louder than any protest. It was the sound of power casually misused. Back in the studio, Olivia didn't react to the footage. She let it play, let the world watch what she had lived through without ever calling it trauma. When the anchor tried to steer the conversation toward healing, Olivia tilted her head, not dismissing the question, but dismantling its premise. "I'm not here to be redeemed," she said. "I'm here to remind you that I was never broken." There were murmurs from the control room. Editors leaned forward, realizing they were no longer crafting a segment. They were witnessing a reckoning with a human face. Olivia listed the directives that had failed, the investigations that had folded, the oversight boards that had nodded and moved on. Each point landed not like a punch, but like a signature. At no point did she ask for change. She declared it. When the anchor asked what she hoped the outcome would be, she didn't offer a policy or a wish. She replied, "I hope the silence feels heavier next time someone chooses it over truth." The room held its breath. Jericho, from the shadows, did not move. He wasn't there to anchor her. He was the silence that made her voice echo louder. As the segment neared its end, Olivia remained seated. The usual cues, closing remarks, music, fade-ins, thank you smiles, died before reaching her. She didn't stand. She didn't nod. She said, "I'm not done. This is the first time I've spoken without someone reaching to turn off the mic, so I'm not leaving it quietly." The network didn't cut to commercial. They couldn't. The feed stayed live as Olivia stared forward, not defiantly, but deliberately. The power wasn't in what she said. It was in what she refused to let be unsaid. She hadn't come to explain herself. She had come to let history record that this time it heard her. And Jericho? He didn't need to be on camera. He had already written the script, wordless, fierce, and complete. Behind the curtain, he closed his eyes. The sound stage hummed, but it couldn't drown out the echo now locked inside every viewer's chest. Olivia hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't pleaded for justice. She had declared herself as its ledger. And this time, the system couldn't press mute. The echo of Olivia's words had barely settled before the spotlight shifted. not with drama, but with deliberate precision. The media, sensing blood beneath the steel, turned their lenses toward Jericho Wallace. Headlines emerged not as questions, but as veiled accusations. The silent force behind the storm. Jericho Wallace, protector or provocateur. One story dug deeper than the rest, unearthing a personnel memo from nearly a decade ago. It read, in impersonal, bureaucratic script, transferred from internal investigations due to divisive conduct and inability to align with departmental culture. The quote spread like kerosene under a match. Beneath it, a single damning line: "He is the kind of man who refuses to shut up." That sentence didn't smear Jericho, it crowned him, because silence in his world was never neutrality. It was complicity with a mask on. But Jericho didn't issue a statement. He didn't call a press conference or offer a rebuttal. His power never came from argument, it came from presence. He walked into the Department of Justice the next morning without a sound crew, without a handler, without a speech. In his hand he carried a locked case, steel, scuffed at the edges, the kind of case that looked like it had weathered war zones, because it had. Inside, a file that had been buried, sealed, shelved, and deemed non-actionable 7 years ago, not because it lacked substance, but because it had too much of it, because acting on it would have ruptured fault lines that people had spent careers pretending didn't exist. The man who once stamped reject across that file no longer worked in government, retired. Pushed out or pulled back, it didn't matter. His decisions had outlived his tenure. And now they would face a man who had waited not out of fear, but out of strategy. The receptionist at the DOJ glanced up. Name? Jericho didn't repeat it. He placed the case on the desk. The thud was enough. He was ushered to a quiet room on the 11th floor, where people spoke in numbers and policy instead of names and emotion. Across from him sat a high-ranking official with a sharp suit and sharper smile, the kind honed by decades of saying nothing meaningful most elegantly. "Mr. Wallace, we understand you've brought something historical." Jericho unclasped the case and slid the file forward. No embellishment, no pitch, just paper, aged but clean. Facts unsoftened by time. Memos, email chains, time-stamped discrepancies, witness statements that had been boxed not because they were false, but because they were dangerous. The official skimmed the first few pages. His fingers twitched. "You understand," he began, his tone warm and serpentine. "If you move to reopen these investigations, the ramifications could destabilize multiple agencies, not just departments, careers, reputations, possibly pensions." Jericho didn't blink. He didn't posture, he just spoke. If the truth wrecks them, they were never built to stand. The man across from him let the silence linger, thinking it might make Jericho waver. But Jericho wasn't negotiating. He wasn't there to be agreed with. He was there because he had outlived the lies, and he knew what came next wasn't favor, it was obligation. "Let me be plain," the official said, smile thinning. "If you go down this road, people will lose their seats. Comfortable people." Jericho met his gaze, unflinching. "Then let the seats be empty. Better empty than occupied by cowardice." There was no flourish in his tone, no moral grandstanding, just a fact, delivered like gravity. The official leaned back, mouth pursed, as if the taste of the words offended him more than their meaning. He looked at the folder again, as if hoping the documents might retract themselves. They did. Outside, the sun didn't shine any brighter. There were no victory chants, no banners unfurled. But something had shifted, because Jericho Wallace had done what few ever dared. He came back, not with vengeance, but with records. Not to burn it down, but to demand it name its arsonists. By evening, the leak hit the networks, quietly at first. Then, like thunder. The story wasn't about corruption, it was about preservation of rot, about a system that had pushed out a man not because he lied, but because he didn't. And Jericho, he didn't speak to the cameras, he didn't retweet headlines, he sat in a room, one hand on a new file, already preparing what would come next. Because this wasn't redemption, it wasn't revenge, it was clear, cold, and clean. And for the first time in years, the badge wasn't shining, it was under a microscope, and the image wasn't pretty. The room didn't creak, it didn't rumble, it didn't shout, but the moment the first officer cleared his throat under the glare of the cross lights, the silence inside the confidential hearing folded in on itself like air before a storm. Jericho sat still, no pen in hand, no tablet on the table, just a presence, dense enough to make oxygen hesitate. The committee chair asked the officer to state his name for the record. The man's voice cracked. Officer Benjamin Rourke. The syllables fell flat on the soundproof walls, but the microphone caught every tremble, every breath of guilt, dragging itself out through his clenched jaw. He was pale. Not the pale of sickness, but the pallor of a man realizing he had long been part of something diseased. "You were trained under which department?" a voice asked. Calm, measured. "Station 42, 3rd Precinct." His answer came too quickly, as if rehearsed. But then came the question that unspooled everything. "Were you given specific criteria during vehicle stops?" Rourke blinked once, hesitated, then the sound of his defeat began. Yeah, there it was. One syllable, and the gravity shifted. "Clarify." The voice wasn't demanding. It didn't need to be. It was procedural, indifferent, and that made it worse. Rourke looked down at his own hands like they had betrayed him. "We were told to prioritize vehicles that stood out. Suspicion makes expensive models in the wrong neighborhoods." A beat of silence followed, long enough for the air itself to thin. And came the push. Rourke's lips parted, then froze. He glanced at the wall behind the committee, not for help, but as if hoping he might evaporate into it. "Drivers," he began, and then, quieter than anything said before, "black drivers, driving luxury cars, especially at night." No one gasped, no one cursed, but a collective breath somewhere in the room snapped like a bone under pressure. The truth wasn't loud, it was clinical. Rot passed off as routine. The recording device didn't blink, didn't judge, it just recorded. Jericho leaned forward an inch, gaze fixed not on Rourke but on the screen in front of him. He raised a single finger toward the observation booth behind the glass. "Play that back," he said. 3 words, not barked, not whispered, just dropped, like steel on marble. A tech inside the booth tapped a command, and suddenly, Rourke's voice echoed across the speakers in chilling stereo. "Black, driving luxury cars, especially at night." The sentence didn't bounce. It landed, heavy, like a coffin's lid closing with certainty. Another officer, seated 2 chairs away, shifted uncomfortably. His name was Avery Klein, mid-30s, buzz cut too neat, knuckles too tight. For 15 minutes he'd sat stone-faced trying to play neutrality like a poker hand. But the playback cracked something. Klein's breath hitched audibly, his shoulders dropped, and before anyone asked him to speak, he did. "I didn't think it was wrong." Olivia didn't move. She didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. But when she spoke, it was with a precision that flayed. "You didn't think it was wrong? Or you didn't want to lose your job over it?" The question landed like a blade balanced on its edge, aimed straight between bone and conscience. Klein looked up at her. His eyes, still trying to negotiate their innocence, met a wall of composure that was colder than any accusation. He opened his mouth, closed it. A second passed, then 3. He didn't answer, because he couldn't, because there was no version of the truth that could stand up next to the silence of Olivia Wallace when she already knew the answer. The panel didn't ask follow-up questions. They didn't need to. Jericho leaned back, folding his hands on the table, gaze steady. His presence wasn't a roar. It was a verdict waiting to be spoken aloud by someone else, and yet the room already knew. What just happened wasn't testimony, it was exposure. There were no raised voices, no pounding fists, just the slow suffocation of systemic rot dragged into the cold light by its creators. Every sentence from the officers was like watching a dam break, not in a dramatic rush, but in quiet fractures, hairline cracks that told a much uglier story. They had all known, they had all participated, and worse, They had all accepted. The room shifted again when one of the committee members, a woman in a deep burgundy suit, turned to face the booth. "Mark that phrase," she said. "Flag it for mandatory retraining review." Jericho didn't smile. Olivia didn't nod. There was nothing victorious here. Just anatomy, surgical, clean, bloodless dissection of a moral failure decades in the making. "You said you didn't think it was wrong," Olivia repeated. Softer now, but no less cutting. "But you kept doing it, night after night, car after car, until it wasn't just your habit, it was your fingerprint." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't tremble. It sliced the air between them with a kind of mathematical ruthlessness. Klein dropped his gaze to the floor, and for the first time the word complicit became more than a legal term. It became a mirror. Someone in the back shifted in their seat, a chair leg squeaking faintly. That was the only sound. The room had stopped breathing. One of the observers whispered to a colleague, "This isn't just a hearing. It's a reckoning." Jericho's eyes stayed locked on Klein, but his silence said what no words could. "We warned you. You laughed. Now, here is your laugh." Played back in 1080p clarity. It wasn't rage that moved the needle. It wasn't protest signs or hashtags. It was the clinical, irrefutable exposure of belief systems wrapped in badges, folded into morning briefings, institutionalized into standard operating procedure, and now unwrapped, replayed, re-examined in the light of real names, real voices, and real victims. The committee chair broke the silence at last. "This record will become part of the permanent file," she said. "All statements are now subject to independent review." Her voice, too, was devoid of drama, just an announcement, like telling someone the ship they were on had already sunk. Outside the room, no one clapped. There was no audience, no spectacle. But when Rourke and Klein stood, shoulders slumped, faces bleached of resistance, they looked less like officers and more like men caught naked in a blizzard of truth. As they walked out, Jericho didn't move. Olivia didn't glance back. The clip was still playing on repeat in the background, a loop of shame immortalized in audio. And while no one shouted, no one needed to, because the real explosion wasn't in volume, it was in revelation, and it had already left a crater. The silence didn't end. It crystallized. What began as a trickle of exposure had grown into a tidal force, and now it collided with something older, deeper, and far more entrenched. Investigative journalists, no longer distracted by statements or spin, turned inward, into the archives, into the forgotten folders, into the redacted lines and digital footprints no one expected would ever be retraced. And there it was, a decades-old lawsuit from 1996, wrongful arrest. A black teenager was mistaken for a robbery suspect, brutalized and detained without charge. The officer in charge of the operation, now Police Chief Raymond Coulter, the man who, years later, quietly oversaw the redaction of Olivia Wallace's complaint, deleting it from internal records, scrubbing timestamps, citing insufficient procedural basis. The connection wasn't speculative, it was structural. Names, dates, authorizations. Coulter hadn't just overseen the misconduct, he had curated its disappearance. Each link in the chain was made of silence, forged by policy, protected by habit. Every erasure bore his initials. Every blind eye had its consent. When the story broke, it didn't explode. It spread, not like wildfire, but like mold, through every crevice, every institution that had once used Coulter's signature as a stamp of authority, a stain across every public record his name had ever signed. Headlines weren't shocked, they were surgical. Chief Coulter, a career built on silence. From 1996 to now, patterns in blue. Editorials stopped asking questions and began issuing charges. The question was no longer whether a cover-up existed, it was how many generations had benefited from it. The city council called for an emergency hearing. Not a session, not a press event, a reckoning. The chamber filled with media, residents, advocates, and skeptics, who all knew they weren't attending politics, They were attending pathology. This wasn't a policy debate. This was a forensic excavation of an entire era, and the room smelled like dust being shaken loose from sealed archive. Jericho and Olivia entered together, not hand in hand, but side by side. There was no armor. They didn't need it. The tension in the air wasn't fear. It was recognition. The room bristled with discomfort, but neither flinched. Jericho wore gray, the color of storms after they've passed, but still threaten. Olivia, black. Unsentimental, sharp, whole. The cameras didn't chase them, they focused, like they were trying to read scripture off their skin. When the council chair asked them to speak, it wasn't a favor. It was a necessity. The room wasn't curious, it was indebted. Olivia stepped forward first, her voice deliberate. You know the names, you've seen the footage. What you haven't done is admit the system didn't fail. It performed exactly as designed, and that design was never neutral. She didn't yell. She never did. Her cadence landed like a gavel strike. I stood here once before, she said. I submitted paperwork. I followed the process. I waited. I was erased. Not because I lied, but because it was inconvenient for me to exist on paper. She let the words float, not as accusations, but as autopsy findings. She wasn't reopening a wound. She was presenting the cause of death. Democracy by omission, equity by exception, truth rewritten in ink that faded on command. Jericho stepped forward next. He didn't look around. He didn't scan for cameras. He spoke directly to the council, as if they were the ones under oath. No one is born believing police are the enemy, he said, his voice even, unmoved. But no one should die for thinking they were safe. The room didn't breathe. The sentence wasn't dramatic. It was anatomical, cutting straight through flesh, history, and myth. It didn't rise to provoke applause. It dropped like iron. He let the weight of it settle, a beat, then another. You weren't surprised by what happened that night, he continued. You were surprised we didn't stay quiet. That line ruptured the chamber, not in chaos, but in clarity. The press reacted like sirens. Phones lit up mid-sentence. Journalists stopped transcribing and started listening. One council member, an older woman with silver in her voice, stood and said, I'm sorry. She wasn't weeping. She was unarmed. But Chief Coulter, seated just a few feet from the testimony, didn't stand. He didn't speak. He stared forward, jaw locked, expression neutral to the point of insult. His face was a mask of cold, bureaucratic disdain, a wall that had weathered complaints for 30 years without a crack, until now. When prompted by the council to respond, Chief Coulter cleared his throat, not out of humility but out of habit. His voice carried the thin, lacquered tone of someone who'd made a career of sounding like protocol. I've served this city for over 30 years, he said, slow, polished, unmoved. I don't owe apologies for doing my job. The room convulsed in silent revulsion. It wasn't just what he said. It was what he refused to acknowledge. There was no remorse, no flicker of doubt. He wasn't defending the badge. He was defending an empire built from paper shredders and memory holes. His loyalty wasn't to justice. It was to permanent. The council chair paused, then looked up, voice clipped to legal neutrality. Chief Coulter, she said, evidence submitted to this body confirms your authorization to redact Officer Complaint 3147B filed by Ms. Olivia Wallace without review or third-party oversight. Do you deny this? Coulter's jaw twitched. I stand by my decisions. No justification, no denial, just the blunt force of bureaucratic arrogance. Jericho didn't flinch. He didn't need to. The silence that followed was louder than any protest, because the room realized Coulter wasn't a relic. He was a blueprint, and the system hadn't failed because of him. It had been built with him in mind. The chair leaned forward toward the mic. Effective immediately, Chief Coulter is hereby relieved of active duty, pending further investigation. The gavel didn't fall. It didn't need to. The words hit harder than wood ever could. Jericho didn't nod. Olivia didn't smile. Neither of them moved, because this wasn't satisfactory. It was the sequence. The removal wasn't justice. It was an excavation. One stone lifted, revealing the rot that had warmed itself for decades beneath the protection of uniform discretion. Outside, the air was thick, not with chants, but with breath held. Crowds hadn't come for a celebration, they came to witness a crack. The moment when the badge stopped shielding and started shaking. News alerts blinked across screens. Coulter removed amid proof of patterned suppression. Cameras panned for sound bites, but none came. The public didn't want commentary, they wanted proof, and got it in a single sentence spoken under fluorescent light. As Jericho and Olivia exited the chamber, they passed the long line of citizens queued against the back wall, people who hadn't spoken yet, but who held folded copies of documents, photographs, names of relatives lost not to bullets, but to silence. Justice today had not shouted. It had taken notes. A young reporter rushed toward them. "Do you feel vindicated?" he asked, voice tight with the need for narrative. Olivia paused. "Just enough. There's no vindication in being right about pain," she said. "There's only proof, and now you have it." She turned. That was the quote, that was the headline, but the impact wasn't in her words. It was in how still she was when she said them, like someone who had learned to hold their breath until the room around them remembered how to listen. Jericho stood silent beside her, his eyes scanning not the crowd but the architecture, the stone pillars, the stained floor, the decades-old cracks where truth had been swept under. He didn't need to speak. His silence had become its dialect, one that said, "We're not done. We're just beginning the part you can't suppress." Back inside, the council chamber emptied in whispers. Coulter remained seated, flanked by legal counsel. One aide handed him a phone. He looked at the screen, froze. On it, the front page of every national outlet blared the same message. Chief Architect of Cover-Up removed from office. Below the headline, a photo of Olivia, not mid-speech, but mid-breath. That was what made it powerful. She didn't look triumphant. She looked necessary. The ripple reached Capitol offices and district courts. Old cases were unarchived. Names previously buried beneath administrative resolution began surfacing with new context. Every officer who had once trained under Coulter's command was now under quiet scrutiny. Not accused, not yet, but exposed. And exposure was how history took back everything silence thought it owned. Later that evening, Olivia sat across from Jericho in a quiet corner of the city library. No press, no podium, just the sound of one fluorescent bulb flickering overhead. She opened a folder. Inside, the faded copy of her original complaint. Stamped, dismissed, forgotten. Jericho placed beside it the updated city council motion. Signed, activated, permanent. 2 pieces of paper. Same case. 17 years apart. One silenced her, the other made the silence illegal. She didn't say thank you. He didn't ask for it, because what they'd just done wasn't a favor or a miracle. It was arithmetic. They added evidence to the absence, until the absence had nowhere left to hide. The shift was no longer speculative. It was seismic. The council's decision wasn't just a disciplinary action, it was an exhumation. By evening, legal analysts across the country were dissecting every line of the motion relieving Coulter of duty. But it wasn't the legal wording that caught fire. It was the undercurrent, the implicit admission that justice had been filtered through hierarchy for decades, and now someone had pulled the plug. At precincts across the state, officers stood in break rooms reading the headlines in silence, some with clenched jaws, some with shallow breath. The words, "pending investigation," carried new weight, not just as a threat to one man's title, but as a warning that the architecture was no longer sacred. Jericho hadn't dismantled the system with protests or speeches. He had infected it with memory. That night, Olivia's words were quoted more than any official source. "There's no vindication in being right about pain. There's only proof." It was played on loops, subtitled, reposted, not because it was dramatic, but because it was undeniable. She didn't plead. She didn't rally, she declared, and the declaration stuck like a burn that refused to blister. Quiet, raw, and permanent. The department's public affairs unit released a statement by midnight. It read like wallpaper. "We are cooperating with city officials. We thank Chief Coulter for his years of service and will conduct a thorough and impartial internal review. No apology, no acknowledgement, just symmetry and spin. The last gasp of institutional language trying to hold form while the structure beneath it caved. But the public wasn't listening to the statements. They were reading documents. Jericho had made sure of that. Scanned PDFs of previously inaccessible case files had already been indexed and mirrored across advocacy websites, legal blogs, and private servers. Coulter wasn't just removed, he was archived. Every decision, every signature, every red line was now evidence, not in a court, but in a culture that had finally remembered how to read between the redaction. The city paper ran a side-by-side, a photo of Coulter receiving his badge in 1989, next to a screenshot of Olivia in the council chamber. The contrast wasn't aesthetic, it was generational. One man built a legacy of deletion. One woman turned memory into law. At 3 a.m., Jericho stood outside the precinct headquarters. Not as a protester, not as a press target, just still. He looked at the building like it was a book with too many chapters crossed out. Behind him, someone approached, an older man in plain clothes. Former officer, retired, face like broken concrete. "You know, he trained us to do it that way," the man said without greeting. "Stop first, think later, always write your report." His voice wasn't angry, just tired. "We thought it made us strong. Turns out it made us blind." Jericho didn't turn. "You're not blind if you knew it was wrong," he said. "You just kept your eyes closed because it was warm in the dark." The man nodded once, then walked away. No redemption offered, none expected, because what had broken wasn't just the process, it was pride. Institutional pride. The kind that wears medals over bruises and calls it tradition. By sunrise, the headlines had evolved again, this time not just about Coulter. Now they listed every case redacted under his oversight. Olivia's name no longer stood alone. It was part of a ledger, long and unfinished. Her file had been the erasure that cracked the pattern, and patterns, once cracked, unravel, whether anyone gives permission or not. Across town, a group of college students organized an open archive session in a community center. Printouts of redacted complaints lined the walls, each one marked with red ink, each date matched with headlines, or lack thereof. Under one document, someone had written what they called misconduct, history will call design. Olivia saw the photo of it online. She didn't share it. She didn't comment. She closed her phone and stared out the window of the train she sat on, her reflection faint against the motion blur. This wasn't a victory lap. It was a reminder of how many trains she had ridden past that building, wondering if anyone inside remembered her name or erased it again before it stuck. Now, they wouldn't forget. Not because they were convinced, but because the silence had become louder than any defense they could write. The mayor's office held a press briefing the next morning. Curtains closed, flags behind the podium, a long table with microphones lined up like sentinels of apology, but none were used for it. The deputy mayor read from a prepared statement, dense with passive voice and carefully trimmed vocabulary. "We recognize the need for transparency moving forward. The concerns of the community are being heard. We are evaluating all historical actions taken under Chief Coulter's leadership. Heard. Evaluating. Moving forward." Every word is arranged to sound like movement while saying nothing. But the city wasn't listening to Polish. They were watching for the one thing institutions fear more than outrage: silence that doesn't go away. Not silence as surrender, silence as pressure, as an audit, as weight. Inside the Department of Civil Records, clerks were now required to manually verify any file previously processed under Coulter's authorization. The order had come down from the council before noon. It wasn't symbolic, it was surgical. There would be no more deletion by default. Every erased name was now a lead. Every void was a question that would not be buried again. Jericho watched the news from his office, not on a flat screen, but through a live stream. Full resolution, raw audio, no editing. He had nothing to celebrate. What happened was not a victory. It was gravity. Something heavy had finally dropped, and the sound it made was accountability, not loud, but absolute. Across the city, community groups held forums. No podiums, no chants, just people reading aloud complaint reports that had never reached the public. A woman read her brother's file. He was stopped 12 times in 8 months, nothing ever charged. Always let go with a warning. A warning for what? Her voice cracked but didn't break. They said he had an attitude. His crime was not being scared enough. Someone else read Olivia's original, redacted report, line by line. Every strike hit harder now. They weren't lines of omission. They were sentences passed without trial. And through it all, Jericho and Olivia remained nearly invisible, not absent deliberate. They had shifted from protagonists to precedents. Their presence no longer needed the spotlight because the system itself had become the theater. Every institution that once ignored them now performed around them, trying to salvage credibility without admitting collapse. Later that week, a national broadcast aired a retrospective, 3 decades of disappearance. The Hidden Files of Raymond Coulter. It was packaged for mass viewership, graphics, interviews, even drone shots of city buildings. But one moment stood out. Near the end, a clip played of Jericho's statement at the council. No one is born believing police are the enemy, but no one should die for thinking they were safe. That line didn't just echo, it closed the program. The screen faded to black. No credits, no outro music, just a pause that felt like the nation holding its breath. That same night, Olivia sat on the steps outside a neighborhood library. No press, no escort, just a folder in her lap. Inside, a handwritten note from someone she didn't know. "Your silence spoke for me. Thank you for refusing to forget." She didn't cry. She didn't respond. She placed the note in her coat pocket, stood and walked home in the dark, because that's what this had always been about. Walking, not waiting, carrying what others had buried, not to resurrect the past, but to prove it never really left. In a quiet corner of a courthouse, a junior clerk discovered a box misfiled under routine stops. It contained dozens of unprocessed civilian complaints from the early 2000s. One included the name of a man long presumed lost to bureaucracy. On the back of the form, scribbled in pencil, were the words, "They said I was too loud. I only answered the question." Those forms would now be reviewed, officially, publicly, and the man who once denied them space had been erased from the chain of command, by his architecture collapsing in reverse. Outside, the city did not erupt. It recalibrated. Every breath, every headline, every pause in a press conference was no longer just noise. It was a measurement of how far truth had finally traveled, not from courtroom to courtroom, but from one woman's erased file to a nation's record. 3 generations of cover-ups hadn't fallen from a single blow. They had buckled under the unbearable weight of being seen. Not with a riot, but with a sentence. Not with a riot, but with a sentence. That's how it had begun, and that's how it now returned. But this time, the sentence wouldn't be delivered by a single voice. It would rise from rows of chairs in a courthouse never meant for stories like these. For the first time in state history, a public hearing had been opened to those whose only qualification was that they had once been stopped without cause. No badges, no law degrees, just memory, paper, and names. Olivia stood first. She wasn't introduced with fanfare. She didn't wear grief like a medal. She simply approached the microphone, adjusted it once, and opened a folder already curled at the edges from use. The room fell quiet, not out of reverence, but because there was no oxygen left for anything else. "I'm not here to tell you how it felt," she began. "I'm here to tell you what happened." And that distinction was a blade. She listed locations, dates, officer names, and reference numbers. Each entry recited without pause as if drawn from a ledger only she could read. She did not tremble. She did not reflect. She reported. Cold, complete, clinical. "The stop occurred at 11:42 p.m., she continued. "There were no grounds established, no citation issued. The body camera was powered off until after verbal contact. When requested to identify the grounds of detainment, no legal precedent was cited. When I asked again, I was told, quote, "This is standard." No one looked away, because she didn't give them permission to. A member of the review panel, dressed in a navy suit that looked pressed to suffocation, finally leaned in. "Ms. Wallace, do you want the officers involved to face prison time?" Olivia looked at him like he had asked if gravity still applied indoors. "I want them to face judgment as citizens," she said, "not as police, not as symbols, as people under the law. That's justice. That's what they claim to uphold. Let them be measured by the same weight they swore to carry." There was no applause, just recognition. Behind her, Jericho remained seated, still. His eyes didn't follow her. They tracked the digital board mounted high behind the panel, a rotating list of every officer currently under review. Some are still active. Some are still armed. Some who had trained the ones who stopped Olivia. He read the names like they were numbers, like each one held a cost not yet collected. The testimonies continued. A man in his 60s detailed how he was stopped 4 times in 1 year for driving his late wife's car. "They said the vehicle didn't match me," he read aloud. "I asked what that meant. They said I looked nervous." A woman recounted how her son was detained, searched, and made to sit on a curb while officers debated whether his accent sounded foreign enough to flag immigration. Each statement was short, not dramatic, each one a blow, not of passion, but precision. Olivia returned to her seat, hands folded. Her face is unreadable, but her presence remained like a note sustained too long to ignore. The panel's lead attorney, sharp-suited and sharp-worded, leaned forward again. "Ms. Wallace, do you believe the problem lies in individual officers or institutional culture?" She didn't blink. "I believe it lies in the expectation of exemption." He raised an eyebrow. "Could you clarify?" "Yes," she said. "They expected not to be questioned. They expected to be protected, regardless of behavior. They expected that fear would speak louder than truth. That's not culture, that's entitlement." The courtroom didn't murmur. It froze, because her tone didn't rise, her voice didn't shake, and that stillness was a scalpel sharper than any scream. Jericho, still silent, reached into his jacket and withdrew a tablet. He tapped once. The digital board behind the panel flickered. Rows of names began cross-referencing with incident codes, flagged complaints, and previous disciplinary records. All compiled through public records his team had spent months collecting. He handed the device to a court clerk without speaking. The clerk walked it to the front, plugged it in, and the room lit up. Red marks appeared next to multiple names on the board. A ripple of unease spread through the panel. Several of those names still wore uniforms. Some were in the building. The visualization wasn't dramatic. It was undeniable. Complaints that had been buried under language like unsubstantiated or lack of evidence were now showing patterns, overlaps, timelines that stretched from the 1990s to the present day. One red dot pulsed twice, indicating a name tied to 2 of the speakers from earlier that afternoon. No one spoke, but the silence was no longer just an absence. It was an indictment. The lead investigator leaned forward and glanced at Jericho. "You built this index manually?" Jericho didn't nod. He simply said, "Public records and persistence." A panelist attempted to change the subject. "Ms. Wallace, are you suggesting mass criminal culpability?" Olivia didn't flinch. "I'm stating mass accountability. There's a difference. One seeks punishment, the other demands truth." The statement echoed too neatly against the digital board, now rotating with even more data. Video timestamps, officer shift patterns, matching statements from unrelated victims whose only common thread was geography and skin tone. Jericho didn't look away. Neither did Olivia, and neither needed to speak because the story had already been told by the numbers. Another council member, graying and visibly uncomfortable, tapped his pen against the table. "You realize the implications of airing these correlations in public, don't you? Officers still in active service may feel unfairly exposed." Jericho finally responded. That's not exposure. That's daylight. The only thing that decays in daylight is what shouldn't survive in the first place. The panel went quiet again, not out of submission, but because the only defense left was indignation, and even that was shrinking. One commissioner leaned toward the microphone, his voice laced with thinly veiled sarcasm. So what you're proposing then is that we strip the presumption of integrity from law enforcement? That we treat them as suspects by default? Olivia's answer was simple. No, I'm proposing we treat them as equals. Same scrutiny, same standard. If they are as honorable as they claim, then transparency should be a mirror, not a threat. And that was the line no one could step over without stepping into fire. Because transparency wasn't the danger. It was the evidence of danger that so many feared. Another voice joined from the back. Unexpected, not scripted. A woman in uniform, badge still pinned, stood in the audience. Her voice was clear, calm, and not rehearsed. I'm Officer Lena Morris. I've served for 13 years. I've been told more times than I can count to let things slide, to ignore certain patterns, to mark complaints as resolved without follow-up. She paused. We weren't trained to be corrupt, but we were trained to look away. The room didn't gasp. It held still, because this wasn't a confession. It was confirmation. I'm still in uniform, she said. But I'm tired of pretending silence equals loyalty. She turned toward Jericho and Olivia. Thank you for saying what we couldn't. She sat back down. No applause, no motion, but something had shifted. A thread had pulled loose from the system's tightly woven defense. The panel, now stripped of its earlier posturing, shifted uncomfortably. One of the attorneys fumbled through papers, searching for the next witness, hoping to wrest back control through procedure. But the process, once broken by truth, no longer had its grip. Another victim stepped up. A young teacher, mid-30s, spoke with a clipped cadence. They stopped me because I had a school laptop in the back seat. They assumed it was stolen. He looked at the panel. You want to know how that feels? It's not fear. It's an insult. It's the knowledge that my profession didn't matter. My name didn't matter. My face was the crime. The chair of the committee finally leaned forward, visibly rattled. We will, of course, be reviewing these incidents by protocol. Jericho stood just once, just long enough. Protocol, he said, not loudly, but with weight, is what they've been hiding behind for years. His tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. It cut clean. When the protocol protects patterns, not people, he continued, it's not a process, it's a shelter. Olivia didn't look at him. She didn't have to. Her words, her presence, her restraint, all had already redefined what testimony meant. The narrative wasn't hers alone anymore. It had multiplied. It had taken root. A final name was called. A man whose brother had died in custody. No charges, no explanation, no autopsy report ever delivered. He didn't cry. He only read his brother's final text message out loud. They pulled me out of the car. I don't know why. If I don't make it, tell Ma I didn't fight. That was the end of the message, and the end of the testimony. No response came from the panel, because what response could follow that? The chair cleared his throat, desperate to restore control, but his voice cracked under the weight of what had just been said. We acknowledge the pain, he offered weakly, as if acknowledgement could stand in for accountability. But Olivia, still seated, replied with a precision that snapped the illusion of comfort. No, you heard the evidence. Pain is not the argument here. Law is. The room fell deeper into silence, not because anyone agreed, but because no one could disagree without sounding complicit. It wasn't sorrow that anchored her tone, it was clarity. The legal advisor beside the chair whispered something, but even that seemed like background noise now. Jericho's gaze returned to the screen, where names continued to rotate in timed intervals. No headlines, no dramatics, just data, quiet, damning, He did not speak again. He didn't need to. His presence had become the moral barometer in the room. Every eye that glanced his way knew there would be no appeals to emotion, no theatrics, no offers of compromise, only the kind of pressure that made pretense crumble. Finally, the head of the Internal Review Commission leaned into her mic, voice low but more grounded than the others. "We've received your testimony, the compiled documentation, and the visual mapping of prior complaints. A full legal audit of those named is hereby approved." That was it, one sentence. No fireworks. But history doesn't always fall like thunder. Sometimes it unhooks quietly. And as the crowd slowly filed out, Olivia remained seated until the last voice left the chamber. She rose only when Jericho extended his hand, not as a gesture of support, but as acknowledgement between equals. There was no victory smile, no media frenzy, just a shared truth. They had not demanded punishment. They had required judgment. As they exited, Olivia looked once more at the panel, not to gloat, but to ensure eye contact with those who had been trained to look away. "From this moment on," she said, "your badges do not come with blindfolds." And then she was gone. The chamber still echoed faintly from Olivia's last words, as if the air itself needed time to absorb the weight of them. But outside, beyond the courthouse doors, the world was already moving. News tickers flashed headlines across city buildings. Hashtags stormed timelines. Olivia Wallace and Jericho Wallace had not just shifted public opinion, they had bent policy into motion. In the days that followed, the city council moved with a speed normally foreign to government. No more subcommittees, no more procedural stalling. Just a single vote called a session, a proposal to mandate 24/7 body cameras for all law enforcement personnel within the city, and the establishment of an independent civilian-led oversight board granted full investigative authority and subpoena power. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a line drawn. The vote passed, not quietly, but definitely. With the legislation signed, the blowback arrived almost on schedule. A contingent of officers, mostly veterans who had once trained others to look away, submitted mass resignation letters. It wasn't about working conditions. It wasn't about principle. It was about exposure, about fear about losing control over the story they used to own. The press conference was called less than 24 hours later. Cameras lined the back wall like sentinels. Jericho stood in front of the seal of the city, no notes, no podium, just him and the lens. He didn't adjust his tie. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't raise his voice. "If you're leaving because you're afraid of being recorded," he said, eyes locked into the camera, "maybe you shouldn't have been there in the first place." No dramatics, no pacing, just clarity that detonated beneath the surface of every ego still clinging to immunity. The statement went viral in less than an hour, but it was Olivia who delivered the strike that would be etched into the walls of future academies. "We don't need cops who make fewer mistakes," she said later that evening during a live town hall broadcast. "We need cops who understand they can make them." There was no applause track, no cinematic pause, but the silence that followed was heavier than thunder. Newsrooms called it a recalibration of authority. Scholars called it a post-myth moment, but Jericho and Olivia didn't call it anything. They simply walked away from the stage, letting the words settle like verdicts written in the air. One station later aired a roundtable of retired officers, some scoffing at the new laws, others uneasy but silent. One, a former precinct captain with decades under his belt, leaned forward and said, "The moment you fear accountability more than crime, you don't deserve the badge." The screen cut to black. The message had already been delivered. For the first time in the city's history, power had changed hands without a riot, without a funeral, without a bullet, just words. Sharp, undeniable, and finally heard. And behind those words, two people who never needed to shout to be louder than a system built on silence. The spotlight had dimmed, the declarations made, and the system left trembling in the wake of exposure. But not every reckoning ends in noise. Some echoes last longest when spoken in a whisper. And so it was that Jericho and Olivia Wallace, no longer just names tied to legislation or upheaval, sat quietly beneath the soft hum of studio lights, eyes steady as the camera rolled. This was no courtroom, no press stage, just 2 chairs, a lens, and the invitation to speak. Not for defense, but for understanding. The interviewer leaned forward, careful not to break the gravity hanging in the room. You've both been called revolutionaries, disruptors, and symbols, but who were you before the noise? Olivia didn't blink. Before, I was someone who was told to wait her turn, speak softer, and never be too certain, and I listened until silence started to sound like betrayal. Jericho looked at her, not as if hearing her for the first time, but remembering it again. His hands were clasped, still, the kind of stillness earned by restraint, not passivity. "We didn't plan to lead anything," he said. "We planned to survive it." The host nodded. "There were so many moments you could have escalated, fought back harder. Why didn't you?" "Because the reaction is what they expected," Olivia said. "But the principle is what they never see coming." Jericho added, "You don't out-yell power, you outlast it." "You remind me that not everyone is looking for a spotlight. Some just want the truth, to have a place to stand." Clips played across a screen behind them, moments the public had already seen, but now framed with their silence. No dramatic scores, no overlays, just facts and restraint. "Again, you've both faced character attacks, surveillance, and institutional stonewalling." The interviewer continued. "What held you steady through it?" Jericho didn't hesitate. Discipline and each other. Olivia nodded once. "You learn after enough years of being overlooked that your power grows in the shadow. We didn't need to scream to be heard. We needed to wait until the room got quiet." The host leaned in, eyes narrowing. "Jericho, what made you keep your composure, even when provoked?" Jericho stared into the camera, his voice low, unhurried. "Justice doesn't need to yell, it just needs to arrive." And Olivia, her expression iron flat with resolve, followed with a sentence that pierced the air like a gavel drop. "Silence is a weapon when they think you've got nothing to say." The audience in the control room, producers, engineers, interns, didn't clap. They didn't need to. They listened, because something in the cadence of this truth made noise irrelevant. It wasn't charisma that held them there, but gravity, the kind that pulls even skepticism into stillness. The host, visibly moved, paused before continuing, her voice softened not by emotion, but by respect. "There's something undeniably powerful about 2 people who dismantled a system without ever raising their voices. What would you say to someone who's still in the silence, who hasn't found the words yet?" Olivia took a breath, not hesitant, just intentional. "I'd say don't mistake quiet for compliance, and don't wait for someone to hand you the mic. Your voice doesn't need permission, it just needs purpose." Jericho added, "They trained us to believe that if we weren't loud, we weren't leading. But leadership doesn't require volume, it requires presence, consistency. And when you build your convictions like stone, not wind, even storms can't move you." The host leaned back, clearly impacted, eyes briefly flickering to the crew through the glass. Something had shifted, not in ratings, not in headlines, but in understanding. Footage rolled again, archival pieces, the earliest public moments of Olivia's lawsuits, Jericho's testimony before Internal Affairs. The old clips had been dismissed by the press when they first aired, but now, in the aftermath of their recent battle, every frame felt newly weighted. These weren't just visuals of protest, they were records of patience under fire. "What did it cost you?" the host finally asked. Olivia didn't flinch. "Time, career traction, safety. There were weeks we didn't know who was watching us, who might follow us home. But cost doesn't deter principle, it just tests it." Jericho's voice was quiet but carried like steel under velvet. "And we never paid alone. We paid together. That's how it stayed bearable. The camera zoomed in slightly, as if trying to close the distance between the viewer and the truth. Olivia's eyes did not waver. This wasn't vengeance. This was proof that a system built on habits could be cracked open by consistency. The interviewer said nothing. She didn't need to. The silence was earned, and in that pause the story found shape, not as spectacle, but as testimony. Olivia and Jericho weren't leaders by ambition, but by necessity. They didn't pursue fame, they confronted erasure. And now, finally, they sat in a space not to relive the trauma, but to define what endured after it. The interviewer broke the silence, her voice careful, deliberate. There are many who say the system isn't built to listen, that change is performative, surface level. What makes you think this time is different? Jericho answered first, steady as a mountain, refusing to shift for a storm. I don't think it's different. I think we're different. This time, we came with receipts, with timestamps, with public memory that doesn't fade after a headline scrolls past. Olivia leaned forward just slightly, her hands clasped, her body still. They taught us that truth doesn't matter unless someone hears it, so we made sure they couldn't unhear it. Every policy we forced through wasn't about idealism, it was about record keeping. You want to change? You document everything they tried to erase. The host's voice softened. Did it ever feel like too much? A pause. Then Jericho said, every day. But too much isn't the same as unjustify. We carried it because no one else would, because too many before us were told to carry it alone. And quietly, Olivia added, this wasn't heroism. It was an inheritance. The burden got passed to us because the system didn't believe we'd have the stamina to hold it. A reel played in the background, shots of the council vote, of resignations piling up, of policy manuals being rewritten in real time. None of it was flashy, but all of it was irreversible. These weren't symbols of disruption. They were symbols of permanence. The host tilted her head. If you could go back, would you do it differently? Olivia's voice, even in its quiet, had a blade in it. Only if I wanted the silence to win. Jericho folded his hands again. Change isn't clean. It never has been. But if you want to outlive injustice, you don't need to be faster. You need to be relentless. The camera captured every breath, every small pause, every deliberate choice not to escalate or embellish. This wasn't a performance. It was post-mortem truth, the kind of survivors who could afford to narrate. The interviewer exhaled, half in awe, half in surrender. You both speak with such clarity, as if everything had a design. Olivia gave the faintest trace of a smile. The design was never the point. The refusal to fold was. The interview wrapped without ceremony. No sweeping soundtrack. No triumphant fist in the air. Just two people rising from their chairs, their silhouettes briefly crossing in front of the stage lights, casting long shadows behind them. They didn't exchange a word. They didn't need to. In the editing bay later, a technician paused the footage on a frame, Jericho's hand gently resting on the back of Olivia's chair just before they turned away. Not dominance, not possession, just weight, just presence. A visual oath that neither had carried any of this alone. Outside the studio, the sun had begun to drop, painting the streets in molten orange. And though the sidewalks bustled as usual, a shift lingered, not in how people moved, but in how they looked, as if they were suddenly aware that history might be walking beside them in plain clothes, without a banner or a hashtag, but undeniable all the same. The interview aired that evening. Uncut, uninterrupted, no commercial breaks. It wasn't trending within minutes. It didn't need to be. It was archived in minds and lesson plans, in boardroom conversations whispered behind closed doors. The soundbite Olivia had given, "Silence is a weapon when they think you've got nothing to say," found its way into headlines, college essays, and protest signs. In one city council building, a plaque was quietly commissioned. Justice doesn't arrive screaming. It arrives standing and stays. No name etched beneath. Everyone already knew who it belonged to. Later that week, A group of law students gathered in a classroom to analyze the interview transcript, line by line. One of them asked, "Was this a turning point or just a well-lit moment in a dark tunnel?" Their professor replied, "Both. It was a spotlight and a mirror." Jericho and Olivia never issued a follow-up. They didn't schedule a tour. They didn't monetize the moment. They walked back into their ordinary days with the same precision they had used to dismantle something enormous. Quiet, steady, complete. When asked privately by a close friend how it felt, Jericho simply said, "Like breathing in a room that used to choke us." And Olivia, hours later, in a separate conversation said, "Like turning down the volume on a world that always thought it owned the mic." They never needed to speak in unison to be heard as one, and that was the lesson. Studio lights faded to black, but the echo of Olivia's final words lingered, like a tuning fork struck deep within the bones of the nation. Not through rage, not through revolution, but through stillness and certainty, the walls had begun to shift. Outside, a colder light took hold, the sterile fluorescent brightness of scrutiny, of consequence, of systems forced to see their reflections, not because they chose to, but because silence, in the hands of the right people, had grown teeth. Just days after the interview aired, a city council member made his move. With a measured tone dressed in performative humility, he addressed the chamber. "Given his demonstrated insight and moral clarity, I hereby propose that Jericho Wallace be appointed Senior Ethical Advisor to the Civilian Oversight Division." Applause scattered like birdshot, hesitant, performative, hollow. On the surface, it was an honor. Beneath it, a trap, a bid to absorb and neutralize, dress the outsider in a badge, and claim reform through proximity. Jericho stood, not out of surprise, not out of gratitude, but because it was time to dismantle the illusion. He spoke without adjusting his suit, without softening the edge in his voice. "I won't enter a system that once expelled me, just to make it look clean from the outside. You don't bring in the voice that exposed you and call it accountability. You call it window dressing." There was a beat of silence, stretched taut. A silence not of reflection, but of defense mechanisms recalibrating. Then Olivia rose beside him. Her voice, low and measured, cut even deeper. "Systems that need outsiders to look pure should ask why they're dirty in the first place. If a structure can't clean itself, it should not exist." No one responded. No one dared. The chamber had grown cold. They didn't storm out. They walked, deliberate, upright, like verdicts leaving the courtroom. But what they left behind wasn't silence. It was ignition. By the time they exited the building, social media had already fractured under the weight of their refusal. A clip of Jericho's words was posted within minutes. Olivia's quote followed. But it wasn't just retweets and sound bites this time. It was essays. It was a lesson plan. It was a movement shedding its old skin. In a high school across town, a 15-year-old student sat quietly in a civics class, rewatching the footage on a cracked phone screen. When asked to write a reflection, they didn't describe anger, they described timing. "I learned that silence isn't always surrender," the student wrote. "Sometimes it's a bomb waiting for the right hands to hold the trigger." The post went viral, but more than viral, it was understood. No political strategist could have sculpted a moment this precise. No PR team could have packaged it more effectively. It was raw, it was rooted. It was the sound of a foundation shifting under its weight. Jericho and Olivia didn't issue statements. They didn't tweet. They didn't clap back. Their silence, once mistaken for passivity, now functioned like steel, reinforcing everything they had already said. They had reached a level of resonance where words became echoes even before they were spoken. Behind closed doors in precincts and committee rooms, their names became shorthand for disruption, for redefinition. A commissioner, reading over transcripts of the interview, muttered to a colleague, "They didn't break the system. They made us admit it was already broken." Elsewhere, old guard defenders of the status quo fumed. One retired chief in an op-ed that reeked of sour authority claimed, "What they're doing is eroding trust in the badge." The response online was surgical. "No," one user replied, What they're doing is refusing to let the badge be a shield for rot. And Olivia, days later, speaking privately to a group of students, echoed what had become a quiet doctrine. You don't need to wear the system to change it. Sometimes, the most radical thing you can do is refuse to wear the costume they give you. This was not a rebellion, it was a refusal refined into a philosophy. They were no longer simply symbols of resistance, they were blueprints. As the news cycle churned forward, as the next scandal loomed and the next debate took the floor, one thing remained unshaken. The system had been forced to recognize that silence, when wielded with intent, could be louder than a siren. And in that silence, Jericho and Olivia had done what no indictment, no protest, no policy alone had managed. They made the system afraid of its reflection. 1 year later, the video that had once pierced the night like a silent alarm found its place beneath a brighter light. In a training room miles from where it happened, filled with recruits still learning how to hold authority without shaking, a screen flickered to life. The room stilled. On that screen, Olivia Wallace's face glowed dimly in the blue hue of the police body cam footage, an image once hidden, now institutionalized. Jericho's silhouette stood behind her, immovable, composed, not as a threat but as a boundary, a signal that silence could carry mass. The instructor, a former officer turned ethics educator, didn't speak over the video. He let it run. No music, no annotations, just raw time breathing between frames. A young cadet, barely 20, leaned forward, studying the way Olivia's hands stayed locked on the wheel, the way the officer's flashlights trembled ever so slightly. The moment passed, measured not in violence, but in the erosion of its possibility. When the screen faded to black, the room remained still. The instructor finally turned and said nothing. Instead, the cadet spoke. "They didn't resist," he murmured, "but they made the whole system answer for it." Those words weren't applause. They were recorded, a quiet entry into a new curriculum that no longer pretended justice was about control. It was about what people refused to accept in silence. That video had become more than a relic. It was a reference point, not for how to dominate a moment, but how to hold it accountable, how to see what power looks like when it stands its ground without raising a fist. Meanwhile, elsewhere, Olivia and Jericho walked through the park without ceremony. No media followed them. No microphones waited. The pavement beneath their feet held more memory than most archives. It wasn't a victory lap, it was a movement, a rhythm kept between them. A syncopated breath shared by two people who had made it through the fire without letting it define them. Children ran past. A dog barked in the distance. Trees whispered. Jericho's coat fluttered slightly in the breeze, his hand brushing lightly against Olivia's as they walked, not clasping it, just there, beside, present, like always. Olivia's gaze swept across the grass where protesters once gathered, where the press once shouted, where shame once stood tall, dressed as protocol. She didn't smile. "Justice doesn't answer right away," she said, softly, more to the air than to Jericho. "But when it does, it never calls the wrong name." He nodded once, as if that was the only punctuation the moment required. Behind them, a bronze plaque had been mounted quietly on a wall near the edge of the square. It didn't name them. It didn't depict the night. It simply read, "Every silence held long enough becomes an answer." No signature, no need. For the system, the video marked a shift not in sentiment, but in instruction. It forced those who wore the badge to confront history not as rumor, but as documentation. Cadets now watched Olivia not because she was extraordinary, but because what happened to her was ordinary, and that was the point. The curriculum no longer glorifies adrenaline. It taught restraint, awareness, the weight of gaze, the ethics of pause, the precision of posture. There were still those who resisted, old-school commanders who rolled their eyes, pundits who called it overcorrection. But those voices, once thunderous, now sounded more like static, a fading signal trying to reassert itself in a bandwidth that had outgrown its frequency. Back in the park, Olivia paused beneath a tree that had once held signs, fists, and grief. Jericho followed her gaze. A child was climbing a nearby branch. The mother didn't stop him. She simply watched. Olivia's voice, low and sure, surfaced again. That night could have ended like so many others. If it had, this kid might have grown up thinking silence meant surrender. Jericho's jaw tightened, not from anger, but from remembering, from knowing how many names had faded before hers had been heard. He didn't speak, but his presence answered. She knew. They both did. The silence between them wasn't absence, it was agreement. The room fell into a pause so deep it felt sacred. After the first cadet had spoken, others sat straighter, absorbing the gravity not just of the clip, but of what it now represented. One hand rose in the back. Another question, not about the law, but about judgment. How do we know when silence is power and not submission? This time, the instructor didn't answer. He rewound the video 10 seconds, replaying Olivia's hand slowly tightening on the steering wheel as the flashlight beamed through her windshield. No words, no movement, just pressure. Measured, grounded, defiant. "That's how," he said. In the hallway outside, quotes from past reformers were etched along the wall, but none bore the weight of what had happened that night in silence. Jericho Wallace's voice had never been raised. Olivia Wallace had not once asked for sympathy, yet their presence had redrawn the boundaries of what restraint could mean in a system that mistook calm for compliance. At another academy across the country, an ethics instructor paused his lecture mid-sentence, turned to the class, and asked, "What's the difference between obedience and complicity?" The answers came slowly. One follows rules. The other enforces silence. One fears punishment. The other fears memory. And still, Olivia and Jericho remained nowhere near the podium. They had long left the spotlight, not because they feared it, but because they no longer needed it. Their story had become something larger, an operating principle, a civic litmus test, a memory that refused to dim. Back in their home, the furniture was the same. The mail still came late, Olivia still preferred her coffee too bitter, and Jericho still sat in silence 10 minutes longer than anyone thought necessary. But in the stillness, there was a clarity neither of them spoke aloud. The weight they'd carried had moved, not disappeared. They had made it transferable. At a community meeting in a city that once dismissed such gatherings as noise, a father stood and said, "I want my son to grow up knowing you can say no without screaming." Murmurs of agreement followed. Not applause, not cheers, but that rare frequency where people finally felt they were not alone. Meanwhile, the officers who once resigned en masse began to find that silence, too, carried consequences. Retirements that once came with back padding and barbecues were now footnoted with scrutiny. Background checks were tighter. Civilian Oversight Board appointments were no longer rubber-stamped. The word reform no longer felt ceremonial. It felt enforceable, and at the federal level, the Department of Justice quietly released new guidelines, ones that included scenario-based training grounded in the Wallace case. No press release, no ribbon cutting, just policy. Precision, progress. One journalist wrote, "This isn't a revolution, it's redefinition." Another op-ed challenged, "If silence can shift policy, what does that say about all the shouting we ignore?" In classrooms, teenagers argued over whether Jericho should have accepted a government position. In barbershops, elders recalled watching the Wallace footage with their grandchildren and choosing, for once, not to shield them. "They need to know what grace under pressure looks like," one said, "and they need to see that it's possible." At a state fair, someone printed Olivia's final words on a shirt. It sold out in an hour, not because it was fashionable, but because people were finally hungry for something more enduring than slogans. Jericho, walking through a local market, overheard two strangers debating if the system was truly changed or just temporarily stunned. He said nothing, but as he passed, the younger one looked over and whispered, "That's him." The older one replied, "He doesn't look angry." "No," the younger said. "He looks finished," but they were wrong. He wasn't finished. He was just no longer explaining himself. They didn't speak of legacy. Legacy was what others etched after you were gone. What Olivia and Jericho built was something else. something living, breathing, inconvenient to those who still clung to the comfort of unaccountable power. It didn't need monuments. It needed memory. Memory coded into training modules, woven into policy rewrites, whispered through the corridors of institutions that used to protect themselves first and asked questions never. At a university in the Midwest, a criminal justice professor paused his lecture, pulled up the now mandatory Wallace footage, and turned to his class. "This," he said, "is not about one woman or one night. It's about who gets to walk away unquestioned. It's about who learns that a badge can be a blindfold." The students didn't take notes. They just watched. Because some lessons don't get written down, they get felt. Elsewhere, a new precinct handbook was being printed. Page 3 bore a new oath. Not just to serve and protect, but to recognize when silence speaks louder than sirens. It was written not by committee, but by experience. Olivia's name wasn't in it. Jericho's voice didn't echo through its pages, but their fingerprints were in every word. In the Department of Justice headquarters, a junior analyst assigned to policy review noticed a training clause labeled Wallace Clause, a procedural reminder that every stop, every check, every approach must be justifiable not just in action, but in motive. The analyst, unaware of the full story, clicked the reference link. She watched the footage. She read the transcripts, and she didn't return to her work immediately. She sat still, absorbing what it meant to inherit a system and choose to rewire it. Back in the city, the park where Olivia and Jericho once stood alone had become a place of quiet reflection. No statue, no ceremony, just a bench. It bore no names, only this: "Sit here if you're ready to listen to what wasn't said." Jericho visited sometimes, always alone. Olivia didn't need to. Her presence had never required location. It had required truth. And truth, once spoken without apology, didn't need repetition to remain thunderous. That day, as Jericho stood in front of the bench, he noticed someone sitting on it already. A teenager. Hoodie up, earbuds in, staring straight ahead. Jericho didn't interrupt. He simply stood there. After a moment, the teen removed one earbud and turned. "You him?" the kid asked. "The guy from the clip?" Jericho nodded once. The kid didn't say thank you. He didn't gush. He just looked down and muttered, "I saw it in class. Didn't know silence could be that loud." Jericho's reply was quiet. "Most people don't." Then he walked away. This wasn't about mentorship. It wasn't about guiding hands. It was about planting something invisible and letting it grow without needing credit. Even now, in certain corners of power, some tried to rewrite the narrative. They framed the Wallace moment as a unique incident, a teachable anomaly, something clean and exceptional. But the truth kept surfacing in the form of uncomfortable questions, departmental resignations, and sudden interest in oversight funding. That was the real legacy: unease. Where once there was arrogance. The system hadn't fallen, but it had flinched, and in that flinch the people found room to breathe. Olivia, now more a presence than a personality, understood this. She didn't tour, she didn't commentate, she didn't sign book deals. She worked quietly with survivors, listening more than speaking, knowing that not all wars needed banners. Some needed bandages. Others just needed someone to say, "What happened to you matters." She didn't need recognition. She had resolve. Jericho continued consulting on internal reviews, but only when the review meant something. He turned down 3 major advisory roles, each accompanied by fat checks and shallow motives. "We want you to help us look credible," one executive said. Jericho had only one reply: "If you need me to look credible, you're already not." Their refusal to become symbols had become a kind of symbol itself, one that didn't bow to applause or pageantry, one that refused the comfort of closure, because there was no closure, only consequence, only continuity. 1 year later, inside a sunlit auditorium of the National Law Enforcement Training Academy, a group of cadets sat in silence. The instructor, a former prosecutor with a trimmed beard and quiet cadence, clicked the projector. The screen lit up with the now familiar freeze frame. Olivia Wallace behind the wheel, her hands locked on the steering wheel, her silence speaking louder than any resistance ever could. No narration, no music, just the raw, uncut recording of the stop that started everything. A young cadet in the front row, sharp-eyed, 23, born after the year Olivia was first profiled, turned to the instructor and asked, "Why do we study this on day 1? The instructor didn't blink. Because they didn't fight. But they made the entire system answer for itself. The cadet nodded once. No one looked away, not because they were told to watch, but because now they understood why they had to. Elsewhere across the country, in a modest neighborhood park, neither famous nor forgotten, Jericho and Olivia walked without purpose. No reporters, no documentary crew, no curious eyes. They didn't walk like icons. They walked like people who had bled, without letting the blood stain them. The path ahead was empty, and that, for once, felt like a victory. There were no grand gestures, no speeches, just the rhythm of two people who had held onto their silence not as submission, but as a strategy. The sun filtered through the trees, dappling the gravel beneath their feet. A breeze moved, indifferent to legacy or loss. Olivia looked straight ahead, her voice barely above the rustle of leaves. "Justice doesn't answer fast," she said, as if concluding a thought that had taken a lifetime to complete. "But when it finally does, it never calls the wrong name." Jericho didn't reply. He didn't need to. His silence, always heavy, always exacting, was the only punctuation necessary. They passed by a bench, unmarked, unassuming. A mother sat with her daughter, explaining quietly why the clip was important, even though nothing happened. The child, no older than 10, asked, "But did they win?" The mother didn't say yes. She said, "They didn't let it keep happening," and that was enough. The final impact didn't arrive with applause or confetti. It didn't need to. It arrived in the small, irreversible rewrites of policy, of culture, of how power spoke when it thought no one was listening. The video became part of the official curriculum. The story embedded itself not as folklore, but as fact. And in precincts once untouchable, body cams clicked on, not out of fear, but out of principle. Citizens asked better questions. Officers gave better answers. Not perfect, but accountable. A generation grew up not needing to believe every badge, but expecting every badge to earn belief. In Washington, a mural was quietly proposed, never approved. Olivia declined the invitation. "Put up systems, not statues," she'd said. "Statues don't speak back when the next person gets stopped." The world didn't change overnight, but the illusion that it couldn't change shattered entirely. And the people who had lived under that illusion the longest finally felt what it meant to breathe without watching the rearview mirror, because of a single moment, a single silence, a single refusal to bow without being broken. Not every fight ends with a flag raised. Some end with a door opened, and the right people are walking through.